All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to PPA 500. We are quickly proceeding toward the end of our time together, so we're running out of days very, very quickly, but I think we still have plenty of time to cover the information we need to cover to complete all the information that we typically cover here in the 500 class. Let me just start out by thanking you for your midterm assessments. I have gone through and reviewed all of those and then returned feedback. My specific feedback, I'll have some feedback for very general feedback in the feedback box. But the more specific feedback you'll see when you look at the assessment in Canvas, you'll see the little blue annotations, like little blue bubbles, little blue pins. If you click on those little blue markings, then you'll see my comments will then pop up. And I think everyone did a really nice job. I think all the grades congregated in the A and the very high upper B level. So the grades were very high on it. And I think that the answers really demonstrated a good, strong understanding of the material and a great ability to critically analyze and apply the material appropriately to address those 5 scenarios. So I was very pleased with your performance on the midterm assessment. So thank you very much for those. Your next assignment that is coming due is Canvas essay number 4. I think I've already told you the good news about Canvas essay number 4 is it's essentially just a redo of question 4A on the midterm assessment. So in question 4A, when on the midterm, you're telling me about public administration as a discipline, and you were then taking a position as to whether or not it was a discipline and then providing evidence to support your argument of whether or not it was a discipline. That you'll be doing then again on Canvas essay number 4. So just take your answer from 4A on the midterm, distill it into a discussion board post, and then post that for Canvas essay number 4, and then respond to 2 classmates' postings. And the reason why I always do that is, you shared with me on your midterm assessment your discussion and your assessment of whether or not public administration is a discipline. What I want you to do now is on Canvas Essay 4 to share your justification, your reasoning with your classmates, get their feedback, and really end up having kind of a nice dialogue among the class members about whether or not public administration is a discipline. And that is an important concept because, again, we are in a Masters of Public Administration program. So explicitly, we are studying public administration. So it's important for us to really understand what we are studying and the parameters of the type of phenomena we study and how we study that phenomena. So that's Canvas essay number 4. What I have on the agenda tonight is, I hate to do this to you because I know you just submitted and had your midterm assessment graded, but we need to talk about the final assessment because that is rolling around very quickly. I think we have the due date set for the final assessment of October 10th, and so that's coming up in a couple of short weeks. I have made the final assessment available on our Canvas site. But as always, I'd like to take some time in class to go through the scenarios and the questions on the final, just to make sure everyone is up to speed and everyone understands what's being asked and the type of material that you'll be responsible for in completing the final assessment. So I think tonight what we'll do is we'll start out with a discussion of the final assessment. And then once we are done talking about the final assessment, then we will move into our material for this evening. And what we will talk about tonight is we will talk about the functions of public administration. Now, last week we finished up with this discussion of the theoretical approaches to public administration as a discipline. And now this last part of the course, tonight and next week, we will get into the functions of public administration. We'll talk about some of the roles and functions that public administrators actually do, working in public organizations in the public sector. And so tonight we will talk about the role and functions of public administrators in public policy analysis. We'll talk about the 3 different phases of policy: formulation, implementation, and evaluation. We'll talk about what goes on in each one of those 3 phases. And then we'll also highlight the roles of public administrators in formulation, implementation, and evaluation of public policies. Then we'll turn our attention to the roles and responsibilities of public administrators in program evaluation. and how public administrators actively engage in evaluating the effectiveness of public programs. So in essence, what we're going to do is we'll start, after we finish talking about the final assessment, we'll start talking about the information you'll start covering in 670 year policy analysis class on policy analysis. And then we'll move into a discussion of the information you'll cover in your 696 research methods course, primarily program evaluation, what program evaluation is, and how we do program evaluation. Once we're done talking about policy analysis and program evaluation, then we will turn our attention to this issue of effectiveness. Because the whole reason why we formulate and implement policies, the whole reason why we evaluate policies, the whole reason why we evaluate public programs is to determine their effectiveness. So we'll talk about what effectiveness means in the public sector. I will offer up to you 4 different models of effectiveness that can be used in public organizations. We'll talk about what those 4 models are and how the definition of effectiveness will differ depending upon which model we are using. Then we'll see where we're at in terms of time tonight. If we still have a substantial amount of time left, we can always work ahead a little bit and then move into our final 2 topics for the course, which would be managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. But we'll reassess our time later on tonight. And I don't want to rush those topics because they're 2 very important topics. One of them is a kind of a little appetizer for PPA 577 human resource management, and the other one is an appetizer for PPA 555 public budgeting. So if we don't have a lot of time left tonight, we may just hold off on those 2 topics then, and that will then round out our information that we cover from a substantive perspective in 500 then next week. So that's our agenda. That is where we are now that we are in the twilight days of this class together. So I just kind of like to reset the table and kind of let you know where we've been and then where we are going over the next couple of weeks. If everything goes well, and I anticipate it will, we cover managing human resources and managing fiscal resources adequately the next week. Then on October 10th, we will reserve that night for you to finish up your final assessment. Again, the final assessment is not done in class. It's exactly like the midterm assessment. You'll be working on that on your own. You've got the full 2 weeks to work on that final assessment using whatever information you have at your disposal, whether it be information from the Kettle textbook, from classic articles, from what we talk about here on Tuesday evenings. And so we won't be doing the final in class on the 10th, but I'll just afford you that time in order to complete the final. Even for hybrid courses like this, the university does require that we have time set aside for a final assessment. And so that time will be then set aside for Tuesday, October the 10th. So that's how the schedule is looking at this point. Before we get into covering the final assessment, are there any questions or clarifications about anything at this point in time? Okay. Then let's spend some time going through the final assessment. Again, the approach is exactly the same as the midterm assessment. You have 5 scenarios and you have 2 questions related to each scenario. The expectations in terms of the length and detail of your answers will be exactly the same as the expectations on the midterm assessment. Everyone did a really nice job on the midterm assessment, and so you know exactly how to do these types of assessments. So I anticipate everyone will do an equally good job then on the final assessment. Like I said, on the midterm, the vast majority of grades, in fact, all of the grades were either in the A level or the very high B level. So everyone performed really well. I'm fine with A's and B's. I don't need to have any type of bell curve or anything like that in terms of grade distribution. If everyone gets A's in the class or a few B's in the class and everyone else gets A's, that's absolutely fine with me. I mean, I don't have any expectations in terms of normal distribution. So I'm sure everyone will do very well on the final assessment as well. So let's start out with scenario number 1. Now, some of these scenarios, we have not covered the information yet. Some of the scenarios will cover the information in class tonight. Some of the other scenarios, we will not cover the information then until next Tuesday. So don't be alarmed if you don't know how to answer these questions now. You will certainly know how to answer all 10 of the questions when we are done with class next week. So this first scenario really gets at some of the information we'll cover next week in terms of public employment, how public employment has changed, and what public employment, especially federal employment, is all about. And that's where we're going to start our discussion then next week when we start talking about managing human resources. So in this scenario, your friend applied for a job with the FBI 8 months ago. She is obviously frustrated with the delay in the hiring process. Bills need to be paid, so she finally decides to accept a job with a private sector company. She laments to you how she wishes she could have waited for the FBI job, but doesn't understand how the federal government hires new employees. As we know, at the federal, state, and the local level, government hiring tends to be very protracted. We have a lot of steps that we have to go through, as opposed to private sector companies that can hire people on an at-will basis. So rather than being able to hire someone the same day like you could in a private corporation, in a public agency, sometimes you have to wait 3 or 6 or 9 months before you can bring somebody into that organization. That's especially true with an organization such as the FBI. We've had a few students in our program that have come out of the program, they've graduated, they've gotten positions with the FBI. A couple of special agents have gone to Quantico to the FBI Academy. Some of them have gotten jobs as background investigators, but it has taken a very long time. It's a very protracted hiring experience. So in 1A, as a good student of public administration, you decide to provide her, your friend, with some background information on the eras of public employment in the United States. Next week, we'll start talking about how public employment has changed in the United States over the past couple hundred years. We'll talk about the era of merit. We'll talk about the era of gentlemen, the era of spoils and patronage, and the era of merit. And I'll walk you through the evolution of the way in which we hire people to work in the federal bureaucracy. And we'll talk about why we move from one era to the next. But describe those three main eras of public federal employment and how these eras have changed over the years. So you get all that information next week. 1B, after regaling your friend with the history of federal employment, you begin to reflect on current hiring practices. What era or eras are best represented by today's federal employment and why? So what era of those three eras we talk about in terms of gentlemen, era of spoils, or era of merit, which of those eras do you believe we are currently in now with our hiring processes, and then a justification for why? Then scenario number 2, the Department of Aging, which is our old friend from the midterm assessment. You remember that very well. Now has a new leader. Mr. Lemon is gone, and the new governor has selected you as the head of the department. You walk into an organization that has neglected human resource management functions for years. One of your first meetings is with your human resources director to discuss how to modernize HR functions. Positions have not been reviewed for several years, and most employees are working outside of their position descriptions. This is information we'll talk about next week in Managing Human Resources. We will talk about job analysis and job evaluation and position classification systems. We'll talk about position descriptions and the problem of people working outside of their descriptions. We'll talk about all that information next week. In question 2A, what would you instruct your human resources director to do? In other words, what functions of human resource management need to be completed? So what are the most pressing things that need to be done in order to modernize this HR department and to bring human resource management up to date in terms of how it should be done in terms of best practices? And again, that's information you'll get next week. 2B, another major issue faced by the organization is its relationships with its bargaining units. The current contract has expired, and the union and department are now at an impasse. Discuss the strategies that could be used to resolve this impasse. Next week, as we talk about managing human resources, we will talk about the influence of unionization. And we'll talk about how public employees tend to be unionized at 3 times the rate of their private sector counterparts. We'll talk about collective bargaining and how bargaining units that represent employees then engage in collective bargaining negotiations with agency management. We'll talk about what happens whenever those negotiations break down and whenever they arrive at an impasse. This is actually a very topical issue right now in the Cal States, and that the Cal State Faculty Union is currently in an impasse with the Cal State system in terms of negotiating a new contract and negotiating salary increases. And so they have gone through a mediation process. The mediation has not worked. They are now in a fact-finding process. If fact-finding doesn't move the needle in either direction to get an agreement, then they'll probably move into what's called arbitration. We'll talk about mediation, fact-finding, and arbitration next week as three different ways in which you can resolve an impasse in the collective bargaining process. So again, don't worry about this one. This is information you'll get next week. Then for scenario number 3, we're going to move into the management of fiscal resources as our topic. The city of Preble Heights, which is another throwback to our midterm, remember Preble Heights was on the midterm as well, is struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in GDP rates. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time and has struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, which are both credit rating agencies, both reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. So in the scenario, I've listed several problems that they have with their budget. And in 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in this scenario. Next week, when we talk about matching fiscal resources, we will talk about different budget formats. We will talk about line item budgeting, which the city is currently using. We'll talk about performance-based budgeting. We'll talk about program-based budgeting, and we'll talk about zero-based budgeting. And so for this 3A, you'll be selecting one of those budget formats we talk about next week and recommending why that is the most appropriate budget format for the city to use to try and address its problems. Then in 3B, I give you a scenario of a situation where the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The aquatic center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and club teams to use the facility for their practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. The operating expenses for the aquatic center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the cost. A bond is when, if you're not familiar with bonds, a bond is where a government will borrow money in order to pay for a capital project. So they will issue a bond. Investors will then purchase that bond. And then the proceeds they get from investors purchasing that bond will then be used to construct whatever capital facility you want to construct. In this instance, it would be renovations to the aquatic center. Your question here is, which type of bond would you recommend that the city use and why? Now, next week, when we talk about managing fiscal resources, we will talk about how cities issue debt, and we will talk about how they manage debt. We'll talk about different types of bonds, such as general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, double barrel bonds. I'll give you some of those examples of bonds that you can select from. You'll be selecting one of those types of bonds we talk about next week and telling me why that is the most appropriate bond to use in this situation and why. So all that information you will get then in next week's class. Now in scenario 4, we're again looking at the city of Preble Heights. And the city of Preble Heights also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, otherwise known as the ERD or ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city, primarily in the downtown area. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it is not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. 4A, from a policy perspective, utilize Pressman and Waldowski's implementation research, which we will cover in a few minutes, to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. So we'll talk about Pressman, Waldowski, and policy implementation. And so you'll be talking about how some of those obstacles to implementation that we talked about tonight could be slowing down the implementation of this policy. And then 4B, drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness that we'll talk about again tonight, examine this scenario from the perspective of each of these models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? One of the topics we'll talk about tonight is the idea that effectiveness is sometimes kind of a slippery term, in that we talk about effectiveness, but there are different ways that we can define effectiveness. And in tonight's class, I'll present you with 4 different models of how to define effectiveness: a goal attainment model, a systems resource model, a participant satisfaction model, and an internal process model. And so for 4B, what you'll be doing is you will be talking about those 4 different models and what those 4 different models would mean for how the organization would define effectiveness in implementing the policy. So after tonight's class, you will be able to answer questions 4A and 4B. That should all be crystal clear after we're done with our material for tonight. And then your 5th and final scenario, it has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. So we're kind of fast forwarding a couple years in the future. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the recreation center. The after-school sports program is offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program has been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of the after-school sports program. So in question 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent variable, dependent variable, and control variables that you would use in your program evaluation. And then in 5B, identify and discuss the research design that you would recommend using to evaluate the effectiveness of the program as well. So this is your program evaluation type of information that we will cover tonight. So once we're done talking about policy analysis, we'll then talk about program evaluation. So again, after tonight, you'll have all the information you need for scenarios 4 as well as scenario 5. Then after next week's class, you'll have the information you need for scenarios 1 through 3. So that's it. That is the final assessment. Again, very similar to what you did on the midterm assessment. Very parsimonious answers are always appreciated. And so if you can keep your answers to 1 or 2 paragraphs, just like you did on the midterm, you will be in very good shape on the final. So now that we've looked at the final, do you have any preliminary questions or clarifications needed for the final assessment? Okay. As you start working on the final assessment, again, depending on your schedule, once we're done with class tonight, you can jump into scenarios 4 and 5 and start working on those right away. As you start working on the final assessment, any questions at all, as always, feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to answer any questions, provide any types of clarifications. And yeah, I agree with you, Jocelyn. It's very good that the Department of Aging finally has a new director, and poor Mr. Lemon is out the door. So I kind of like using throwbacks to our previous exam too. It's kind of nice to have that thread of continuity between our assessments. Okay, let me go ahead then and pull up the slides for what we'll be covering tonight. So I'll give those a second to load here. Loading, okay. And let me start the show. And like I said, what we're going to do tonight, hold on, let me open up my chat box as well. What we're going to be talking about tonight is we're going to be talking about the roles and responsibilities and functions of public administrators in policy analysis and program evaluation. So this last part of the class, this last part of material, what we're covering tonight and what we're covering next week, kind of falls under this heading of the functions of public administration. And so this is when we kind of preview for you your other core courses you're going to be taking in the program. Now, when we talked about theoretical approaches last week, the public administration, we foreshadowed your 660 organization theory class. And I kept saying to you, you'll cover more of these theories once you get to organization theory, but this is just kind of whet your appetite for organization theory. But what we're going to cover tonight will whet your appetite for the policy analysis class 670, for research method 696. What we'll cover next week will then get you ready for 577 human resource management and 555 public budgeting. So tonight we're going to look primarily at policy analysis and program evaluation and what public administrators do in both policy analysis and program evaluation. Now, we need to, at the very outset here, kind of draw a distinction between what is public policy and what is a public program. Now, admittedly, there are MPA programs across the country that will combine these two concepts of policy analysis and program evaluation together into the same course. For many years, I've served as a site visit chair. And so every year I go out, I chair site visit teams. We go out and we visit programs that are going through the NASPA reaccreditation process. And so I get to see a lot of the curriculum, the curricular items that are being used by different programs around the country. For 3 years, I served as an accreditation commissioner on the Commission for Reaccreditation. So I've seen a lot of different manifestations of MPA curriculum. One of the things I have seen is some programs will have a core course called Public Policy Analysis and Program Evaluation, or analyzing and evaluating policy and programs. And so they'll combine them together into one core course. Our approach in this program, I think, is more the dominant modality, which is to separate them into two separate core courses. And the reason for that is that there are some differences between how you study and analyze public policy versus how you study and evaluate a public program. So the example I oftentimes like to use is if you think about a bridge. So you think about this long bridge. The bridge that you're driving on, you can see as being a public policy, but all those stanchions that hold the bridge up, those are public programs. So public programs are those specific programs that we implement that are meant to then support the overall goals of that public policy. And so the bridge is the public policy, and then the stanchions holding that bridge up are the public programs. And I think that's probably a good way to think about the distinction between policies and programs. Now, in terms of policies, we can have overarching policy goals. We can also have individual goals for each of our public programs, but hopefully the goals of our programs will all feed into the overarching policy goals. So give you an example, maybe you might have a policy that looks at educating at-risk youth. And so the goal of that policy may be to increase graduation rates each year by 20% for youth that we consider to be at-risk youth. So the state would have a determination of what it considers to be at-risk youth. So our goal is to increase graduation rates among that student population by 20% per year. That's our overarching policy goal. Now, how do we achieve that? We achieve that with the specific programs that are meant to support those graduation rate increases. So we may have a program of after-school tutoring, and those after-school tutoring programs are meant then to help people graduate. Maybe we might have an after-school sports program that is meant to try and get people to think more favorably about school. And by thinking more favorably about school, hopefully it means that they will have increased retention rates and they'll stay in school and they will graduate. Those are two specific public programs that support the overarching policy goal of increasing graduation rates by 20% year over year. So I think that's a good illustration of the relationship between public policies and public programs. Public policies tend to be much more general. Public programs tend to be much more specific ways in which we can achieve those overarching policy goals. So in the public policy process, and you'll talk all about this when you get to your 670 policy analysis course, the public policy process is really made up of three main stages. There's policy formulation, policy implementation, and then policy evaluation. So in formulation, we're creating the policies. In implementation, we're actually doing the policies. We're actually implementing them, creating the products and goods and services. And then in the evaluation stage, we go back and we evaluate the effectiveness of those policies and how well we have achieved and what progress we've made toward achieving our policy goals. There are prominent roles for public administrators to play in all three of those phases of the policy process. Last week, we talked about the politics administration dichotomy of Woodrow Wilson, and we acknowledged that politics administration dichotomy is really not much of a dichotomy anymore. Very soon after it was developed by Wilson in the late 1880s, by the 1930s, we realized that there's not that strong line of demarcation between the political and the administrative world. The administrators are oftentimes very much involved in policy formulation. The policymakers, elected officials, will be relying upon those administrators to provide them with knowledge and expertise to then help them in developing and formulating these policies. Sometimes identifying the issues that need policy change. That identification sometimes comes from those administrators as well. And so there's a very pronounced role for administrators to play in policy formulation. But before we can formulate a policy, the issue or problem that that policy addresses must get onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. A few weeks ago, we talked about the idea of power in public administration. And I introduced you to John Gaventa in his nuanced definition of power and his three different types or three different faces of power. Where he said those three different faces of power were overt power, mobilization of bias, and co-optation. We said mobilization of bias was agenda setting, and that's something that Gaventa saw in his case studies in those coal mining towns. He saw that there were no pieces of legislation, no laws being passed by the state legislature governing mine safety because the coal mine owners were able to set the agenda of the state legislature. They were able to keep those issues off of the formal decision-making agenda through campaign contributions and through political influence. So agenda setting is kind of the gatekeeper for how these issues and problems make it into the policy formulation stage to then have policies developed to address them. So a policy, an issue or a problem must first get onto the formal decision-making agenda, and that's what we refer to as agenda setting. John Kingdon is a very famous political scientist who talked a lot about agenda setting. He talked a lot about how issues get onto the formal decision-making agenda. And for John Kingdon, his focus was primarily on Congress, and he actually developed this very intricate flow chart to explain to us how members of Congress view issues and how members of Congress end up voting on issues. But Kingdon made the argument that we've kind of got what he called a primordial soup of issues. We've got all these issues and all these problems that are bubbling around out there that we know about, that we are aware of, but we're not really doing anything about. And we really won't do anything to solve those problems and those issues until those issues make it onto the formal decision-making agenda. And oftentimes what you need an entrepreneur, someone who is so interested in this problem, so interested on this issue, that they will bring it to the attention of Congress or the attention of a state legislature to then get it on next session's formal agenda to then have a policy made. When we are formulating these policies for these problems and these issues that have made it onto the formal decision-making agenda, we are engaging in oftentimes different approaches to decision making. There are different ways in which you can make decisions about how to address these issues and these problems. So in policy analysis, there are basically 4 different decision-making models that we typically talk about in policy formulation. 4 different ways in which we make decisions. Rational comprehensive decision-making model, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and a 4th model known as garbage can model of decision-making. So let's take a look at those 4 different decision-making models, what they are and how they work and how they contribute to our understanding of how policies are formulated. So the first one is one that you're probably very well familiar with, and that is rational comprehensive decision-making. Rational comprehensive decision-making is just what it sounds like. It is rational and it is comprehensive, meaning that we are going to take into account all of the possible information in making our decision about how to address this issue or this problem in our public policies. So we go through several different steps. The first step in rational comprehensive decision making is we clearly identify the problem that we are trying to solve and our goals in trying to solve that problem. So the goals are kind of like the so what. So if you've got a problem, you've identified the problem in terms of a lack of disposable income for households under a certain income level. That's the problem. They don't have enough disposable income. So the so what is, well, they need more disposable income so that they can enhance their quality of life. So the goal is to try and increase the amount of disposable income that these eligible households will have as a result of participating in this income subsidy program. So we know what the problem is. They don't have enough disposable income. And we know what our goal is. It's to try and increase the amount of disposable income that they have. So in rational comprehensive decision-making, we can clearly identify those things in step 1. Once we've clearly identified our problem and we've clearly identified the goals we're trying to achieve, then in step 2, we're going to go out there and collect all the information possible. So we're going to go out there and mine information from every source we possibly can mine information from, collect all the available information, and then we'll use all that available information to put together a full range of solutions to this problem, a full range of alternative solutions, sometimes referred to as means for solving that problem. The important thing here in rational comprehensive decision-making is we are going to generate a full range of alternatives or solutions to the problem, meaning every solution, every alternative that's possible, we will put into this full range of alternatives. Based upon this full range of alternative solutions, we will then analyze them and we will then select the best alternative solution. And then that best alternative solution then becomes the heart of that policy that we are formulating. So if we're trying to increase the disposable income of income eligible families, the quote unquote best solution might be a direct cash transfer directly to these income eligible households. That's something that for years was done at the state level, known as general assistance. And for many years, state governments had general assistance programs whereby if a household was below a certain income eligibility level, they would then get a direct cash transfer of $200 or $400 or $600 per month directly into their bank account to then try and increase the amount of disposable income that they have. That's an example of rational comprehensive decision-making. Obviously, the advantage of rational comprehensive decision-making is just that. You are being rational and you are being comprehensive. So one would think the more rational you are and the more comprehensive your decision-making process, the more likely you are to come up with the best alternative and then be successful and effective at achieving your policy goals. What are some of the problems with rational comprehensive decision-making? What are some of the criticisms of rational comprehensive? Any problems associated with it? If you think about it from the perspective of who's engaging in this, who's making these decisions, yeah, as Crystal says, there can be some personal bias involved. And sometimes that personal bias will mean that we are not selecting the policy approach based upon the empirical evidence that we have collected. We may be selecting that policy approach based upon our own personal bias. And so we're not really being rational when we are using our own personal bias. And there's certainly implicit bias that people are not even aware of that could influence the choice of policy approaches. So it's not always technically rational. It's not always technically based upon empirical evidence alone. And the reason why there is this personal bias, this potential for implicit bias, is because we have human beings who are making these decisions. As we know, human beings have limited cognitive abilities. It's just the nature of the world, is as human beings, we have limitations to just how much information we can access, how much information we can review, how much information we can then assimilate. We have limitations in terms of our ability to be rational. It's what Herb Simon refers to as bounded rationality. I'll put all this in text chat, but bounded rationality. Herb Simon says we have these cognitive limitations as human beings, and so there's a boundary. There are limitations to just how rational we can be. We probably do not have the cognitive ability to go out there and understand all the information and collect all the information that is out there, all the information that is possible. We also have limitations in terms of time. We have limitations in terms of resource. Now, granted, information today is much more ubiquitous than it's ever been in the past. It's much easier for us to get access to information than the way in which we were able to get information in past generations. An example is, when I would take a law class back in my undergraduate days, and we would have to go and shepherdize cases. If you've ever done any law work, you know what that means. Shepardizing cases means that you literally go to Shepard's law books, and you would then actually review that case from a Shepard's law book, pull that book off the shelf. It would take a very long time. It was difficult to find the appropriate case and all the case precedents. It was a very time-consuming type of endeavor. Today, you don't shepherdize cases like that anymore. I mean, you've got LexisNexis, you've got all these other services. You can just sit down on the computer and get every single precedent that's related to that case absolutely instantly within the matter of a few seconds. So it's true that information is ubiquitous. The problem, though, is it actually imposes more of a burden on us in terms of being knowledgeable consumers of that information. And I really think that's going to be one of the challenges we're going to have as a society moving forward, is how do we wade through all this information, and how do we determine what information is credible, what information is not credible, so we can only use credible information in order to arrive at our decisions. So I think that bounded rationality that Herb Simon talks about really does limit the application of purely rational comprehensive decision making in policy formulation. Because we oftentimes cannot be purely rational and entirely comprehensive in how we make our decisions, another approach to decision making that you have probably encountered before is what's called incrementalism. And incrementalism comes to us primarily from an author named Charles Lindblom. And Charles Lindblom wrote this article in which he described how decision making was actually done in public organizations. Lindblom argued that when organizations make decisions and when policies are being made, step one is difficult. It's difficult for us to clearly define our goals of our policy. It's also difficult for us to come to an agreement on what the problem is to begin with. It's difficult for us to clearly identify the problem. If you can't clearly identify the problem, you're probably not going to be able to clearly identify what you're trying to achieve by addressing that problem. So we very seldom can actually clearly define our problems and our goals. In step two, because of our bounded rationality and our cognitive limits, we are not able to go out there and collect all the information that is available. So we will collect as much information as possible. We'll collect as much information as our cognitive limitations, as our time, as our resources will allow us to collect. So we're collecting much less information. We put together our range of alternatives, our range of solutions to the problem. It's going to be a much more limited range of solutions. It will not be a full range. It will be a very limited range of solutions. When we look at our limited range of solutions, we will then engage in what Lindblom calls limited successive comparisons. So we'll look at potential solution A, and we'll compare that to solution B. We'll then compare solution B to solution C. We'll then compare solution A to solution C. That type of transitive type of logic is what's called limited successive comparisons. We're not able to really generate the best alternative. We can't generate the best alternative because the quote unquote best alternative may be out there that we never even thought of. We never even considered it because we weren't able to have the cognitive ability to collect information that would allow us to generate that best alternative. So what we're doing is we're selecting from our limited range of alternatives the first alternative that is appropriate and works for us in this situation. It's what Lindblom refers to as the process of satisficing. Called satisficing. We'll select the alternative that's appropriate to us and that works in our situation. We then implement that satisficing solution, and that then becomes our policy goal and our policy approach. It's what he refers to as incrementalism. Over time, the difference between rational comprehensive decision-making and incrementalism has been represented as this dichotomy of the root versus branch approach to decision-making. The root approach is rational comprehensive, where we get to the root of the problem, we get to the root of the tree. Incrementalism is referred to as the branch approach to decision-making. We can never get to the root of the problem, so instead we're working at the margins and we're working with the branches. So root versus branch approach. The advantage, obviously, of incrementalism is that it's a more realistic way of making decisions. It's a quicker way of making decisions. It's a less time and resource intensive way of making decisions. It sometimes works better in public organizations to make incremental types of decisions. Another advantage of incremental decision making is that when you are making incremental decisions, you are making small changes from one year to the next. So you're never really going back and throwing out your policy approach and coming up with formulating a brand new approach to the problem. You are just making small changes from one year to the next year. This is how we typically do budgeting. If you look at most public budgets, you'll see last year's budget will look a lot like this year's budget. We'll be spending on many of the same items. Many of the line items will be exactly the same between last year and this year. The difference will be small marginal increases in spending this year as compared to what we spent on those line items last year. That's incrementalism, and incrementalism really does carry the day when we were making decisions in terms of budget policies. The problem with incrementalism is that if you are funding a policy last year and that policy is not achieving its goals, you're probably going to still continue funding it this year because you don't have the information to show you that it's not accomplishing its goals. So sometimes we will continue to repeat the same mistakes year after year after year in funding our policies. And that's one of the main criticisms of incrementalism. Charles Lindblom, when he wrote his article talking about incrementalism, received a great deal of acclaim. He won a lot of awards, and he was shocked by the amount of acclaim that he won, because he said when he wrote that article, he was merely just describing how decisions were actually made in public organizations. He said he wasn't developing any new theory. He was just describing how decision-making worked within public organizations. I think when you look at most decisions in organizations, kind of those, day-to-day decisions, they're obviously going to be done with incrementalism. Bigger decisions, at times, you'll have glimmers of rationality, where we'll try and be a little bit more rational for those bigger decisions. And that approach is our third approach to decision-making, known as mixed scanning. And mixed scanning is a theory that comes to us from a theorist by the name of Amitai Etzioni. It's a great name in decision-making, Amitai Etzioni. And Etzioni makes the argument that we can do mixed scanning, where we can kind of combine the best of both worlds. So for our big, momentous, important decisions, we will try and incorporate as much rational, comprehensive decision-making as we possibly can. For our much smaller, mundane, day-to-day types of decisions, we can get away with incrementalism. We don't want to put all the thought and all the effort into rationality. for a very mundane, day-to-day type of ordinary decision. So big decisions get rationality, smaller decisions get made through incrementalism. In theory, it makes a whole lot of sense. Your big issues you want to take your time with, your smaller issues, you can just, continue doing what you did in previous years. And so it saves us a lot of time and effort, and it really does make a lot of sense from kind of that theoretical perspective. What do you see any problems with mixed scanning? Are there any problems with this idea, big issues, you use rationality, small issues, you use incrementalism? Any criticisms or problems associated with that? Sound good to everybody? Going back to our discussion before in terms of, personal bias, and like Crystal pointed out with personal bias, there can be some bias here too, as well, in that what one person considers to be a big issue, another person considers to be a small issue, and vice versa. So it's kind of subjective to say what is a big issue versus what is a small issue. So sometimes it's not quite as clear cut to know when to use rationality versus when to use incrementalism. One great example of mixed scanning in use is in terms of budgeting. And when you go ahead and take your budgeting course, your PPA 555 course, you'll talk about two main types of budgets. You'll talk about operating budgets and you'll talk about capital budgets. Operating budgets are designed to fund the day-to-day operations of an organization, to keep that organization kind of running on a day-to-day basis. Capital budgets are designed for capital projects, and capital projects are these high price tag, long lifespan types of things, such as constructing a new city hall, constructing a new school facility, buying a new fleet of police vehicles. Those we consider to be capital projects because they cost a lot of money and they're going to be with us for a very long period of time. That city hall that you're constructing, it will be with you for generations. So that's a big decision. Should we spend $120 million on this new building? That's a very big, momentous decision. So for those types of decisions, we tend to try and be as rational as we can possibly be. And so we have a separate capital budgeting process where we'll put together a capital improvement plan. We'll do a benefit cost analysis in order to determine which of these projects are worthy of putting these hundreds of millions of dollars behind. We'll be a lot more rational and take our time with those capital projects and capital budgeting, as opposed to an incremental approach that we typically use in operating budgets. So I think that difference between operating and capital budgets is a perfect microcosm of this mixed scanning type of decision-making in practice. So rationality, rational comprehensive is on one side of the spectrum, incrementalism's on the other side of the spectrum, and then mixed scanning kind of is in the middle gray area, kind of pulls elements of both of those models together. A fourth model that I am very fond of is a model known as garbage can model of decision making. Now, I love the theory and the concept behind the theory. I hate the name of it. I think garbage can model of decision making is kind of a misnomer. It kind of makes us think that, well, we'll just throw a bunch of things in the garbage can, shake it up, and pull it out, and that's going to be our policy. It's not the way in which it works. So I wish they would have named it something other than garbage can model. But in garbage can model decision making, we tend to formulate policies. We tend to make policy decisions and what the authors call the confluence of four different streams of thought. So there are four different streams at the point at which these four streams all flow together, at the convergence, the confluence of those streams, that's where we tend to make policy decisions and formulate new policies. Those four streams are what are referred to as the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and then the choice opportunity or triggering event policy window type of stream. So in this first stream, the participant stream, in order to formulate a policy or to make a big change to an existing policy approach, you need to have the quote unquote right decision makers in place. You have to have participants in place who are predisposed and ready to make a big change to the way in which we are dealing with a problem. So, an example of this could be in terms of welfare reform in the mid 1990s. Mid 1990s, we get this Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as welfare reform. The purpose, the goal of welfare reform was to move people from welfare into gainful employment, move them from welfare to work. We had participants in a Republican majority in the House and the Senate, and a Democratic president who came kind of from the more conservative part of the Democratic Party. Bill Clinton was a former leader of the Democratic Leadership Council, so a more conservative Democrat who really came to an agreement in terms of what the problem was. And the problem they saw with welfare policy is that it was a self-perpetuating policy, and that generations would just remain on welfare and future generations would then go on welfare, and it was a self-perpetuating type of welfare cycle. So they came to an agreement on the problem. And that's kind of, you got the right participants in place who are predisposed to make a decision. The problem stream is what I just mentioned, is that they came to an agreement on the problem. The problem was that, as they saw it, welfare policy at that time was self-perpetuating, and they wanted to break the quote unquote cycle of welfare dependency. So they had the problem identified, and they identified their goal. And the goal is to break the cycle by moving people from welfare into work. The solution stream, you had this stream of solutions, all these possible solutions that were floating around out there. And now this is where garbage can model decision making parts company with our other decision making models. With rational, comprehensive, and incrementalism, the problems predated the solutions. So a problem gets onto the decision making agenda. We identify the problem, we identify the goals we're trying to achieve, and then we develop a solution, and that solution then becomes our policy approach. So it's a very linear process where problems always predated solutions. In the garbage can model decision making, it's a non-linear type of model in that solutions may predate the problems. I like to refer to it as that if you like Quentin Tarantino movies, this is a Quentin Tarantino approach to decision making. You know, Quentin Tarantino movies kind of jump around all over the place in terms of they're not sequential. They jump back and forth in terms of the timeline. Well, that's kind of the idea here, in that solutions may predate the problems. Well, the question is, how can a solution predate a problem? Because the solution could have been developed decades ago to address and solve a different problem, but it may be applicable to take that pre-existing solution and apply it to this modern day problem we're trying to solve now. So solutions can predate problems. And so we select the solution that fits the problem. So you have to have that solution stream of all these possible solutions out there that you can select from. And then the fourth stream is the choice opportunity stream. The choice opportunity stream means that something happens that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change in how we're addressing this policy, or we need to formulate a new policy. You know, whenever people say there ought to be a law, whenever they say there ought to be a law, they're basically saying we need to formulate a policy that deals with this problem. Well, whenever you have this galvanizing of public opinion that it's time that we address this problem, it's time we solve this problem, that then opens up what John Kingdon calls a policy window, at which all four of these streams can then come together. And it's at the juncture of all those four streams at where we usually make most of our policy decisions. That's where most new policies end up being formulated. So to give an example of how that has worked, one example is an airline disaster that occurred back in 1996, known as the ValueJet crash. So in 1996, we had this ValueJet flight number 582, and it crashed in the Florida Everglades, killing all 110 people on board. That was a triggering event. That was an event that really galvanized public opinion around the idea of airline safety, that we need to make airlines safer. You had consumer rights groups, you had members of Congress who were ready to make a decision, ready to formulate a policy to try and avoid having this type of a crash ever happen again in the future. So you had the right participants in decision-making positions. The problem was, obviously, we had something that had happened on board this plane that caused it to crash. What had happened on board the plane is that you had a fire that broke out in the cargo bay of the plane. By the time the crew realized that that fire had broken out, it had already burned through the electronics on the plane, and it rendered the plane unrecoverable, and the plane then crashed in the Florida Everglades. We knew that if the crew knew about this fire early enough and had the means by which to put this fire out before it spread to the electronics on board, the flight may have been saved. So we knew what the problem was. We were not able to detect smoke, and we were not able to detect fire in the cargo bay of planes. So we had a clearly defined problem. The solution was a solution that we did not develop based upon this problem. It's a solution that had been around for many, many years, and that's the placement of smoke detectors. So if we place smoke detectors and require smoke detectors to be placed in the cargo bay of these planes, then we can be alerted to fires that may break out in the cargo bay, and we can then avoid the type of event that occurred with this triggering event of the crash of ValueJet 582. It's a good example of how all four of those streams, participants, problem, solution, and trigger event, all came together in order to prompt us to promulgate and formulate this new policy mandating the placement of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. So again, just kind of an example of how garbage can model decision-making oftentimes works. Now, the type of decision-making that is used will depend upon the specific context of the policy situation. At times, we are very incremental in that we tend to just continue with the same policy approaches we have used in previous years. Sometimes we have some glimmers of rationality. Whenever there's a lot of concern about this problem, the problem gets covered in the media, the magnitude of the problem then becomes much larger. People get very concerned about it. We tend to be a little bit more rational in the way in which we're making our decisions. A lot of times you get this confluence of problems and people and solutions and triggering events, and that's how our policies tend to be formulated. So there's no one right answer that this is how we always make our policy. It really does depend upon the context of the situation and the specific policy problem that you are talking about. But I just want to introduce you to those four different ways that we tend to make decisions in policy formulation. You can then hold on to those four different decision-making models. You'll be talking about those on your and discussing those as you talk about your answers on your final assessment. But then you'll also be using these four decision-making models once you get to your 670 policy analysis class as well. But that first phase of policy formulation is a phase of policy formulation that Woodrow Wilson did not really envision much of a role for public administrators to have. We now know today that public administrators are very much involved in policy formulation by providing knowledge and expertise that policymakers can use as they make these decisions in formulating policies. Where we usually think of a much more pronounced role for public administrators is in the second phase of the policy process, which is policy implementation. And as you all probably know, policy implementation is the actual implementation, the actual carrying out of those policies. So as public administrators are charged with executing the policies that are given to them by elected officials, they face a lot of barriers and a lot of obstacles to proper implementation of those policies. Even the best designed, the best formulated policies can fail if they are not properly implemented. And one of the studies that you'll be referring to on your final assessment is this study by two authors, Jeffrey Pressman and Aaron Waldowski. And Pressman and Waldowski wrote probably the most famous policy implementation study of all time. Back in the 1970s, they looked at the implementation of a federal program in Oakland, California. And what they want to know is they want to know why the implementation of this federal program was failing in Oakland, because it was failing miserably. And so what they did is they did a case study. And in their case study, they found several barriers or obstacles to proper, effective implementation of this federal program. And I've listed many of those obstacles there for you on the screen. The first obstacle they identified was the presence of multiple goals. For this federal program that they're using for their case study, they realized that there was more than one goal for this policy. And there are multiple goals, and oftentimes those multiple goals actually conflicted with each other. That achieving one of the goals oftentimes meant not being able to achieve another goal. So it left implementers with a situation where they had to make decisions of choosing which policy goal to pursue, which policy goal to ignore. So the more multiplicity of goals you have and the more conflicting those goals are, the more difficult, obviously, it will be to properly and effectively implement that policy. A second obstacle they found was the number of decision points that were left to implementers. The more decisions that implementers were required to make, the less successful the implementation tended to be. That if implementers had to make a lot of decisions about the specifics of how to implement this policy, the more decisions they had to make, the less successful the policy was. It's because you have multiple administrators who are implementing this policy, and you had some implementers who would make one decision, another implementer would make a different decision. Those decisions would conflict with each other, and the policy would not be implemented. So the more decision-making points, the less successful policy implementation tends to be. They also looked at the support or opposition of implementers and how intense the support and opposition of implementers tended to be. Obviously, if you have very strong support of the policy by implementers, that policy would likely be implemented fairly quickly and without a lot of changes. If you had implementers that strongly oppose the policy, that policy is never going to be implemented, because there are lots of ways in which implementers can drag their feet and slow down implementation of policies that they do not tend to agree with. Another obstacle they noted was bargaining, the amount of bargaining that goes on in how the policy gets implemented. The more bargaining that there is, the less likely it is that the policy will be properly implemented. So you want to have as little bargaining as possible in the implementation process. They also noted that for this program, there was the creation of new agencies where the federal government came in and created a federal agency to help the state and local government implement these new policy objectives. The creation of a new federal agency sometimes can help, but sometimes can hurt, because sometimes the new agency, federal agency, then gets into a turf war with the state and local agencies that are charged with implementing the policy. And so sometimes you're kind of overlaying another level of bureaucracy on top of an already highly bureaucratized implementation of a policy. So Preston will also kind of leave us with the impression that it's oftentimes a miracle that some of these policies actually get implemented during the implementation phase because of all these potential obstacles. But of all those obstacles, the one that Pressman and Wildofsky really highlight is this idea of the intensity of support or opposition of the implementers. Obviously, your best case scenario for implementation is if you have implementers who support the policy and they strongly support that policy. They have a very high intensity to the support of that policy. There you're going to have very, very minimal delays and you're going to have no bargaining. The policy will essentially get implemented as it's envisioned to be implemented. That's your best case scenario. The worst case scenario is just the opposite of that. If you have implementers who oppose the policy and they very strongly oppose the policy and the policy's goals, that's when you have maximum delay. That's when you have a lot of bargaining over the very essentials of the policy. That's the type of policy that's probably not going to be implemented, at least not implemented effectively. If you have implementers who support the policy, but they're not really strong in their support, they support it, but they're not really going to spend a lot of their own political capital supporting it, you're going to have some minor delays. You probably won't have a lot of bargaining, but the delays will become a little bit more than if they were high intensity supporters. And then I'm sure, as you would guess, if you have implementers who oppose the policy, but not that strongly, that's where you have your moderate delays. And your bargaining is bargaining not over essentials, but rather bargaining over peripherals. So bargaining over the margins of the policy and how that policy is being implemented. So what this boils down to is that essentially of all these barriers and obstacles, a lot of it boils down to the amount of support that you have from the implementers. You need to have implementers, administrators who support the policy in order to have effective implementation of policies. And that is a theme that's also noted by another important scholar in the field named Martha Durthik. And Martha Durthik argues that in order to get implementers to support a policy, we need to involve those implementers in the formulation of that policy. That if administrators are involved in the formulation of the policy, they have some buy-in. They have what economists would call some sunk costs into the success of that policy. So if they participate in developing and formulating the policy, they are going to then have some skin in the game and actually be very interested in properly implementing that policy. So Durthik tells us the more we can involve administrators in formulation, the better the implementation and smoother the implementation process will be. But clearly, there's a very pronounced role for administrators in implementing public policies. Then the third phase of the policy process is evaluation. In evaluation, we have to go back and we have to evaluate the success of the policy. How well has the policy achieved its stated policy goals? Now, this can be a really tricky thing to do with public policies because not all of the goals can be achieved in short order. That some of the benefits of this policy will take some time for them to actually manifest themselves. That if you go and you try and evaluate the success of a policy a month or two after it's being implemented, it probably hasn't had time to be successful. So there's a thing in evaluation known as evaluability assessments, where administrators will have to assess the readiness of the policy to be evaluated. Sometimes it will take 6 months, sometimes it will take 9 months, sometimes it will take more than a year for a policy to be ready to be evaluated. Some of the things we look for in these evaluability assessments is we look at how measurable are the goals of the policy. Are there measurable goals of this policy where we have measurable indicators that are ready to be measured? If you don't know how to measure the goals of the policy, it's probably not ready to be evaluated yet. The evaluation process is all about creation of formative feedback so that you can feed back information about how successful the policy is to then feed it back into the formulation process to redesign the policy as necessary. You can also feed that information back into the implementation process to determine if implementation needs to be modified and how the policy is being implemented. But you need to have this formative feedback loop where the information you are generating in evaluation can then be fed back into policy formulation as well as policy implementation. So there is definitely a pronounced role for administrators in all three stages of the policy process. Now, you are in a Master's of Public Administration program, so our focus in this program is primarily upon the skills that are necessary to effectively lead and manage public and nonprofit organizations. That comes directly from our mission statement that we looked at on our first night of class together. However, this MPA program is being delivered within a Graduate Center for Public Policy and Administration. Policy is a very important part of what public administrators do on a daily basis. As we pointed out, administrators have a vital role to play in policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation. As you get to your PPA 670 course, you will talk in 670 about some of the specific methods and some of the specific skills that administrators use when they conduct policy analysis. You'll talk about things such as thematic analysis. You'll look at scenario writing. You'll look to a degree at cost effectiveness analysis, and you'll learn all those different techniques in 670 to then allow you to engage successfully in the analysis of public policies. But again, we have roles to play in all three of those phases: formulation, implementation, and evaluation. But as we said, for a policy to be effective and for a policy to be successful, it needs to be supported by relevant and well-constructed public programs. And so back to that bridge analogy, the policy is the bridge, and the stanchions, the supports that hold up that policy, those are then going to be our public programs. So that's why you have a separate core course, PPA 696, that looks specifically at program evaluation and the role that administrators play in evaluating public programs and introducing you to a lot of the skills and techniques that administrators use when they evaluate the effectiveness of public programs. So it is 5:15 and we are at a really nice breaking point now. So let's go ahead and take our evening break. And I think we're doing fine on time. So let's take a break until 5:30. We'll come back at 5:30 and then we will get into a discussion of program evaluation, what administrators do and how they evaluate public programs from an empirical basis. And then once we conclude with that, we will then talk about the 4 different models of effectiveness and kind of really try and wrap our arms around what makes for an effective program, what makes for an effective policy, and really what makes for an effective organization in the public sector. And then once we get through that, I think that will wrap up all of our information then for the evening. So take a break, come on back at 5:30, and we'll shift gears into program evaluation. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a good break. Now we're going to turn our attention to program evaluation and the role of public administrators in the evaluation of public programs. And again, to kind of give you that foreshadowing of some of the techniques and skills that you'll talk about in your 696 research methods course. And I will mention, I think I've mentioned it to you before, but for PPA 696, we really redesigned the course several years ago to make it a program evaluation type of emphasis. When I first came here to Long Beach, I started teaching research methods right away. It was one of the first courses I taught back in 2001 now. But when we taught research methods back in the day, we taught it as classical social science research methods. So we taught it very similar to the way in which a research methods course would be taught in political science or how it be taught in psychology or sociology. But we decided that it really didn't fit the needs of students in an MPA program because what students in an MPA program really use those social science research methods for, primarily for the evaluation of public programs. And so that's why we changed the orientation of the class into a programmed evaluation type of a course. When we did that, we removed the statistical analysis section of the course. And that's why you now need to satisfy a prerequisite in statistics before you'll be issued a permit to then register for 696 program evaluation. So now the way in which we deal with statistics in 696 is kind of from an application perspective. And so what types of statistical analysis would be useful for evaluating different types of public programs, as opposed to actually sitting down and calculating statistics like you would have done in your undergraduate statistics course. So 696 is a lot different than it was a few years ago. So since the focus of 696 is very much on the evaluation of public programs, tonight we're going to talk about why we evaluate public programs and some of the specific ways in which we do it as administrators. So the primary purpose of program evaluation is to apply empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of a public program. Important part of that definition is that term empirical methods, because we always have the question, well, what is empirical? What does the word empirical mean? Empirical means when you are collecting tangible information that you can collect and you can analyze and you can then render decisions from the analysis of that tangible information. Empirical information can be both quantitative as well as qualitative. Empirical information can be numbers-based, like in a quantitative type of world, or it can be qualitative in that it's represented by words and phrases. Words and phrases and qualitative methods, just another way of communicating as compared to numbers being used in quantitative methods. But qualitative or quantitative can both fit into this, underneath this rubric of empirical methods. We are applying empirical methods for the purpose of collecting empirical data and then analyzing that empirical data to determine how effective our public programs are. And again, when we're done talking about program evaluation, I'll introduce you to those 4 models of effectiveness. And we'll talk about kind of the nuanced definition of what we mean by the term effectiveness. Now, when we're doing program evaluations, some of our program evaluations are what we call program impact evaluations, and some of them are program implementation evaluations. And just like the names would suggest, in a program impact evaluation, we are looking at the impact of that program. We're looking at the consequences, the outcomes of that program. So people are participating in an income subsidy program. What's the outcome of that participation? And so an effective program may be measured in terms of, as we said before, an increase in the disposable income of the participants in that income subsidy program. So that would be a program impact evaluation. A program implementation evaluation, we look at how we are implementing the program to try and determine, is there a more efficient or more effective way of actually implementing that program. So you can look at this kind of in a systems model, where in a basic systems approach, you have inputs that go into an organization. Those inputs are then taken and transformed within the organization in order to create outputs. Those outputs are things such as the products and the goods and the services being created by that organization. And then those outputs will then result in outcomes. And the outcomes are the consequences of those outputs for citizens, for consumers who are consuming those outputs. So it's inputs into the organization, then we implement that to then create an output, a product or a service or a good, and then that product, service, or good then results in outcomes or consequences for the people who are then consuming those outputs. So in a program implementation evaluation, we're kind of getting into what we call the black box of the organization, where we're looking at how we are actually creating, how we're actually implementing these programs. And then for a program impact evaluation, we're really looking at the outcomes. We're looking at the consequences of the implementation of those programs. Now, those are not mutually exclusive. You can do a program evaluation that focuses on both impact orientation as well as implementation, or you can do either or. Those are just 2 different approaches to program evaluation. So how do we do program evaluation? Essentially, what we're doing with program evaluation is we're taking a lot of those classic social science research methods that we're all so very familiar with, and we are applying those research methods. We're placing them within the service of evaluating public programs. So we'll follow a lot of the similar steps that we would have done in a classic social science research project. So as you know, step number 1 in social science research is to identify your research question, identify your purpose. So here we are identifying our evaluation question. Evaluation questions kind of follow the same requirements of a good research question. They need to be clear, that they're easily understandable. They need to be answerable, something that can be answered through the collection and analysis of empirical data. And they must be possible to generate more than one answer. There's more than one possible answer to this evaluation question. If there's only one possible answer to the evaluation question, we probably already know what that answer is. So they need to be clear, answerable, and have more than one possible answer. On the screen, you see a couple of examples of evaluation questions that harken back to a 696 case study in directed research that was used several years ago. And in that case study, we had a program called the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, or IRIP. And the Inmate Reading Intervention Program was being used in prison settings in order to increase the literacy rates of incarcerated individuals in the hopes of trying to decrease the chances of recidivism, the chances that those individuals will then reoffend. So a very simple directional type of evaluation question could be, does the Inmate Reading Intervention Program decrease rates of recidivism? Or to put it another way, does participation in the Inmate Reading Intervention Program decrease rates of recidivism? So that's a directional question because we're asking, does participation lead to a decrease in reoffending? Another way to fashion that evaluation question could be, how does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? By just saying affect, we have a non-directional type of question. We're not saying it's going to decrease or increase. We just want to know how it is going to affect in a non-directional type of orientation. So we develop our evaluation question very similar to how we develop it in a social science research setting. And then just like in social sciences, we have to clearly identify the variables that we are going to be using in our program evaluation. In a program evaluation, we are typically going to have a dependent variable. That dependent variable, as you know from research, is the variable that is being changed. In program evaluation, the dependent variable is oftentimes the result or the impact of program participation. So for example, on the previous screen, our dependent variable would be rates of recidivism. This is the variable that's being affected by participation in the IRIP. We'll have a primary independent variable, and in program evaluation, that primary independent variable is oftentimes some measure, almost always, some measure of the program itself. So there are different ways in which we can design that primary variable. One way we can design it is in terms of measuring the participation, whether or not someone participated in the program. When we measure something in terms of whether or not someone participated, that's what we refer to as a binary independent variable. That's a binary variable because it will be measured either as 0, the person did not participate, so 0 for no participation, and a score of 1 for participation. It's a way in which we can see which people participated and which people did not participate. So that's one way we can measure that primary variable of program participation. Another way we can measure the primary variable, independent variable, if we wanted to, is we could measure it in terms of the amount of participation. So we can make it more of an interval type of measure where we could measure the number of hours that someone participated in the IRIP program. So someone may have participated for 10 hours, someone may have participated for 100 hours. That's how we would then measure our independent variable of participation in the inmate reading intervention program. So there are lots of ways in which we can measure participation in the program, but typically our primary independent variable is participation in the program, and we want to see the impact participation in the program has on our dependent variable, which would be rates of recidivism. In order to be able to do that in program evaluation, we oftentimes have to then create what we call the control variables. Control variables are other variables that may independently affect the dependent variable. So we would have to think about what other variables could have an impact upon recidivism rates. Well, we know from criminal justice literature that recidivism rates can be directly affected by the type of crime committed. Was it a violent crime or a non-violent crime? Was it a crime that involved drug use? Crimes that involve drug use tend to have higher recidivism rates than crimes that do not involve drug use. Another control variable could be the number of prior offenses, because people who have a lot of prior offenses are much more likely to recidivate, to reoffend, than people who have a small number or no prior offenses. So those control variables are designed so that we can try and parcel them out of the equation and isolate the true impact of participation in the program on the resulting dependent variable, which in our case would be recidivism rates. So we really need to come up with some clear variables and indicators of exactly how we are going to measure the dependent, the primary independent, and our control variables. Then also, like in social science research, we also have to settle upon what we call a research design, or for our purposes, we would call it an evaluation design. Now, if you remember back to your undergraduate research, you know about different types of research designs. We can have experimental designs or we can have quasi-experimental designs. We're not really going to deal with pre-experimental designs in this class because pre-experimental designs are really of very little use to us in program evaluation. So you can have an experimental or a quasi-experimental design. Experimental designs use random assignment, whereby we can randomly assign the subjects in our evaluation to either an experimental or a control group. And you know from social science research, the experimental group is the group that is exposed to the independent variable. So these will be the people who participated in the program. The control group will be those subjects who did not participate in the program. In program evaluation, we kind of change our terms a little bit in comparison to the terms we use in social science research. So in social science research, we call our experimental group the group that actually participates in the program, that is exposed to the independent variable. We call them the experimental group. However, when we are in evaluation, we refer to the experimental group usually as a project group. So the project group is the group that participates in the program. Then the control group, as we were called in social science research methods, in evaluation design, that control group becomes what we call a comparison group. So instead of experimental and control groups, we have project groups and we have comparison groups. Project groups participate in the program. Comparison groups do not participate in the program. The advantage of using an experimental design is whenever we randomly assign subjects to either a project or a comparison group, through that process of random assignment, we are ensuring that the project group participants and the comparison group participants are equivalent in every single dimension, every single factor, with the exception of participation in the program. So the only difference between our project and our comparison groups is the project group, they participated in the program. The comparison group did not participate in the program. So if there are differences in terms of the dependent variable rates of recidivism, then we can ascribe those differences to participation in the IRIP program. And that's the advantage of using random assignment. You see, I've listed on the screen for you different specific types of experimental designs. A classic experimental design where you have a project group and a comparison group. The R stands for random assignment. The O stands for an observation, and the X stands for the implementation of the independent variable, or for our purposes, the participation in the IRIP program. That's a classic type of experimental design. And I've also listed a few others for you: the Solomon floor group, post-test only, pre-test, post-test, single group design. Those are just merely examples of experimental designs. On your final assessment, when you are talking about the evaluation design that you would recommend for that scenario, I'm not expecting you to get into these specific types of designs like classical and Solomon floor group. I'm just expecting you to talk about either an experimental design or a quasi-experimental design. So you only have to deal with those kind of the category level without really getting into the specific types of designs themselves. So to recap, in an experimental type of evaluation design, we are randomly assigning some people to participate in the program and some people not to participate in the program. Clearly, the problem there is when we are dealing with public programs. A lot of our public programs are eligibility-based programs, in that if people meet the eligibility requirements to get benefits from the program, they should not then be denied those benefits. And so if you are legally eligible to participate in the program, we cannot tell you not to participate in the program for the sake of our evaluation design. So oftentimes we do not have the ability to randomly assign people to a project or to a comparison group. If you cannot randomly assign, then you're not going to be able to use an experimental design. So the option that you'll then have to use is what's called a quasi-experimental design. The vast majority of the evaluation designs that we use in program evaluation are quasi-experimental in nature. In a quasi-experimental design, since you cannot randomly assign to groups, you do not have assurance that your project and comparison group are equivalent to each other because you haven't been able to randomly assign. So therefore, to ensure their equivalency, what you will need to do is you will need to create those control variables. So we might want to create some demographic control variables, such as variables measuring education level or income level, or combine those together in what we call socioeconomic status level. For the example that we use with the IRIP program, we would want a control variable in terms of the number of prior arrests that they had. We'll want a control variable in terms of whether or not the crime was a drug-involved type of a crime. We may want to have a control variable in terms of, do they have a documented address? And it kind of sounds strange, but the criminal justice literature tells us that people who have a documented residence have lower recidivism rates than people who do not have that documented address. So those are some control variables that we will create. And then by measuring all of our cases on those control variables, we can establish then the equivalence between our project and our comparison groups. So that again, if there are differences in recidivism rates, we can then isolate the reason for those differences as participation in the inmate reading intervention program. So the quasi-experimental evaluation design is the one that we typically tend to use most oftentimes in program evaluation, because we lack the ability to decide who participates and who does not participate in these entitlement types of programs. One very common type of quasi-experimental evaluation design that we use is a longitudinal time series analysis. Whenever we have variables that can vary over time, we will want to measure them in a longitudinal nature, where we will measure those variables over a period of time so that we can see how the values of those variables fluctuate over that period of time. So longitudinal time series analysis is a very common type of quasi-experimental design. But again, on your final assessment, I'm just looking at you, looking for you to make this distinction between, am I going to use an experimental design or I'm going to use a quasi-experimental design, and why? And that's about as far as I really expect you to go on our final assessment. Now, once you get into 696, you will get into all these different types of designs. And at that point in 696, you will then be expected to be able to distinguish between all the specific categories of designs. We also have to determine where our data will be coming from. Now, again, we are making our decisions in our program evaluation based upon data, empirical data that we are collecting. So we oftentimes cannot collect information from an entire population, from every single person who is participating in a program. So rather than doing that, we will construct a sample. And as you all know from your undergraduate research, a sample is just a subset, hopefully a representative subset of your population. So we'll select a subset of program participants, and then we will study that subset of those program participants. There are a couple of different ways in which you can construct a sample in program evaluation. In the same manner, you could do it in a social science research project. One way is using what's called probability sampling. Probability sampling utilizes random sampling. And the word random means that it is random if every single subject in the population has an equal non-zero chance of being selected as part of the sample. That's important. An equal non-zero chance of being selected. If so, then you have what's referred to as a simple random sampling design. Simple random sampling design, you would get a list of all your program participants. You would number that list of participants. You would then use a random number generator, either a computer program, or if you're old school, you can go to any statistics book, leaf through the statistics book back to the appendices, and there'll be an appendix with random number table. And you select using random number generator cases from your list of your population called your sampling frame. And then those cases that are selected from your list of your population will then become part of your sample. It's known as simple random sampling because it is as close as we can get to each case having an equal non-zero chance of being selected. A simple random probability type of design will give you a sample that is relatively representative of your population. And that's important. The more representative the sample is of the population, the easier it is for you to generalize your results from your program evaluation of your sample to an evaluation of the program effectiveness for the entire population of people participating in the program. It's what's called external validity, and you'll get into that in your 696 course. Another probability type of design that is not purely random is what's known as stratified random sampling. Stratified random sampling is used in program evaluation if there is a particular variable that is so important to you that you want to stratify or split up your sample according to that variable. And so sometimes we stratify our samples according to gender. And so if you're looking at a salary, a supplemental salary type of program, and we want to then stratify our sample according to males and females in order to try and see if there are salary discrepancies. Sometimes an example that a textbook I used to used all the time is in a senior center. And you're in a senior center and you want to do an analysis of why people are falling in that senior center. So you would stratify your sample according to senior citizens who fell and senior citizens who did not fall. And that's what's called stratified random sampling. It's not purely random because you're essentially creating categories, and then you will try and have equivalent numbers in each of those categories. It's really not purely random because if you meet your quota of the number of people you want in the fall category, then by definition, you're not going to select anybody else who fell. And so it's not a purely equal non-zero chance of being selected. Systematic sampling, just to continue with this discussion, a systematic sample. An example of that could be if you had a local health clinic, and that local health clinic is providing services on an anonymous basis. And since all services are being provided on an anonymous basis, as a researcher, as an evaluator, we want to evaluate how happy people are, how satisfied they are with services they're getting from the local health clinic, but we don't know who they are. We don't know who is using the services because it's all done on an anonymous basis. So you can use a systematic sampling approach where the evaluator could actually stand outside of the local health clinic and then survey every 10th or every 15th or every 20th person who walks out the door. It's systematic sampling because you're not sampling everybody, but you're sampling every 10th, 15th, or 20th person. In systematic sampling, that's called the skip interval. And so we'll interview every 10th person. So we then skip people 11 through 19, and then we sample person number 20, skip people 21 through 29, sample person number 30, and so on and so on. There's a random component to it, but again, it is not purely random. Because if you're selecting number 10, number 20, and number 30, that means that number 9 and 11 have a 0 chance of being selected. So it violates the assumption of an equal non-zero chance of being selected that we usually expect with random sample. The fourth probability type of approach is something that's used very commonly in program evaluation, and that's called a multi-stage cluster sampling approach. This is especially useful if you do not have a list, what we call a sampling frame, a list of the population at the unit of analysis that you are interested in. So say, for instance, you want to look at the impact of a program on households. So the unit of analysis you're interested in is households. You do not have a list of all households throughout the entire state of California. That just doesn't exist, a ready-made list that you can get your hands on. So what you'll do is you'll do a multi-stage cluster sample. So you'll first select a random selection of counties. So maybe you'll select 5 counties. Then from those randomly selected counties, you'll then select a random sample of cities within those counties. Then from that random sample of cities, you'll then select a random sample of neighborhoods. Then from the random sample of neighborhoods, you'll select a random sample of streets. Then from the random sample of streets, you'll then select a random sample of households. And that's a way in which you can create a sample of households using multi-stage cluster sample. It's multi-stage in nature in that you are selecting clusters of groups randomly from counties to cities to neighborhoods to streets to houses, which makes it multi-stage and cluster sample. Multi-stage cluster sampling is something that is used commonly in evaluation by the Census Bureau when it's not doing its every 10-year constitutional enumeration of the population. Most of the other evaluations that Census Bureau will do will be done using multi-stage cluster sample. Sometimes in your program evaluation, you do not have the luxury of using a probability design. You do not have the luxury of random sampling. In those instances, you would then use a non-probability type of sampling design. In a non-probability type of sampling design, again, you're not doing random sampling because you cannot. So an example of a non-probability type of design would be a convenience sample. So if I want to know what MPA students think about PPA 500, I could talk to all of you and I could survey all of you tonight because we're all sitting together. You're kind of a captive audience here on a Tuesday evening. It's convenient for me to interview you, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily representative of the rest of the MPA student population. You may be, you may not be. I don't know if you're representative of the rest of the population. So it'd be difficult for me to take the results from our informal survey of this class and then extrapolate those results to the entire MPA student population. But it's cheap, it's easy, and it's quick to do, convenient sampling. If you are dealing with a program evaluation that involves a hard to reach population, such as a population of people who lack affordable housing, people who are suffering from homelessness, you're not going to have addresses for those individuals because they don't have those addresses. And so therefore, you'll use kind of a referral process known as snowballing. So you'll collect data from one person who is homeless, and then you'll ask them to refer you to someone else who is in a similar situation. You would then interview that person, ask them to refer you to someone else, and so on and so on. So you can see how it's called snowball sampling, because the more people you get, the larger and larger your sample will become. The moral of the story here with program evaluation is if you want to generalize the results of your evaluation to the entire population of program participants, you are probably going to need a probability type of sampling design, because those are the designs that better represent the population as opposed to a non-probability design. Non-probability designs are usually used in very early stages of research or very early stages of program evaluation. You then have to collect data from these individuals, from these subjects. And one of the most popular ways to do that in program evaluation is survey-based research. In 696, you will talk about strategies for constructing surveys. You'll talk about some of the best practices in terms of how to structure questions, how to structure response categories, how to avoid loaded questions, how to avoid asking two questions in one. You'll learn about how to sequence questions on a survey. It's important that you sequence your questions appropriately in order to get the highest response rates possible. For instance, whenever you're asking a very sensitive question, so a question about income, that's an important question, but it's also a very sensitive question. If you lead your survey off with a question on income, chances are people are going to just throw the survey away. They're not going to complete it. However, if you have a 20-question survey and your income question is question 18 or 19, people have already completed the majority of the survey. They have a sunk cost in finishing that survey, so they're much more likely to go ahead and answer that income question and return the survey to you. So you tend to have much higher response rates if you can sequence your questions appropriately. You'll learn how long surveys should be, how many questions you should ask depending upon the type of audience that you are dealing with. And so you'll learn how to do email surveys as opposed to paper surveys, and different types of survey programs, things like, Survey Monkey and all those different types of programs that have made survey data collection very, very simple. Sometimes we'll rely upon secondary data. So pre-existing databases can be very useful to us in program evaluation. Why reinvent the wheel if the data already exists? So you'll talk a lot about how you collect that data in doing your program evaluations. Then once you collect your data, then you must engage in data analysis. And this is something that a lot of people don't appreciate. They don't like statistics a lot, but statistical analysis is really the staple of program evaluation today. The types of statistical analysis that you will use will depend upon the purpose of your evaluation. Are you doing a very descriptive evaluation? So are you asking questions such as, how many people participated in this program this year? That's a descriptive evaluation question. You can use very simple descriptive types of statistics. means, mode, median, things such as that, standard deviations, very simple descriptive statistics. If you're looking at the association between variables, so you want to know association between likelihood to participate in the IRIP program and the type of crime that someone's incarcerated for, then that's stepping it up from descriptive statistics. Now you're looking at, is there an association? Is there some type of relationship between those two variables? And so then you'll have things like Pearson's R and some other types of association related measures. Most of the time with a program impact evaluation, we are targeting causal types of relationships. And so when we're looking at causal relationships, that's where we're going to use the more advanced statistical methods. That's where we're going to use things such as multiple regression analysis, binary logistic regression analysis, sometimes factor analysis, sometimes your survival and path analysis. And there are a lot of those types of statistical approaches that will allow us to see the causal relationship between participating in a program and this desired type of outcome. And then once you analyze your data, obviously you'll then arrive at your conclusions in terms of the effectiveness of the program. Now, the problem we run into with program evaluation is that we would think that if a program is evaluated and we discover the program is not being effective at achieving its goals, we would either scrap that program or we would go back and we would revise that program in order to try and make it more effective. The problem is that politics will get involved. And sometimes there's a political imperative for a program to continue, even though it is not cost effective, or even though it is not achieving its goals. I always say when I teach the budgeting class that political imperatives trump economic imperatives, and that there are oftentimes political imperatives that allow programs to continue, even if the program evaluation says that they should not. But hopefully what we're doing is we're using the program evaluation in order to either decide whether to replace the program or whether to redesign the program to make it more effective at achieving its goals. Program evaluation is a necessary role for administrators to play in their organizations. The problem is that program evaluation is oftentimes starved for resources, in that it's not a very high profile, it's not a very politically advantageous thing for elected officials to put a lot of money into program evaluation. So oftentimes we do program evaluation with limited resources, sometimes on a very much of a shoestring budget, but it still is a very important type of function that administrators do to make sure that what they are doing and the programs that they are implementing are being effective. Which then leads us to our bigger question of, well, what do we mean by effective? I think usually when we think about the effectiveness of a policy or the effectiveness of a program or even the effectiveness of an organization, we're oftentimes thinking about it from a goal perspective. We're oftentimes going to ask the question, how well did this policy, this program, or this organization achieve its stated goals? That approach to effectiveness is what's known as the goal attainment approach. That is by far the most common approach to measuring the effectiveness of policies, programs, and organizations. To what degree did we achieve our stated goals? However, that is not the only way to measure effectiveness. And there are three additional models that we talk about in this class for measuring effectiveness. The second model is what's called the systems resource approach. The third model is the participant satisfaction approach. And the fourth model is the internal process approach to measuring effectiveness. So let's take a look at all four of those models to kind of give us a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of what we mean by effectiveness in the public sector. Again, the goal attainment model is by far the most common because it is the simplest approach. In a very linear manner, it looks at what are we doing as an organization and how is that helping us achieve our goals? Or what are we doing with this program and how is that helping us to achieve our programmatic goals? So it's very much this linear relationship between what we are doing and the achievement of our goals. It really views management as being a very rational and orderly process where we have one singular expression of goals then we can then measure whether or not we've achieved those goals. The problem is that sometimes it's too straightforward and too simple of an approach, in that there are complicating factors in using a goal attainment approach. Goal attainment approach doesn't really consider when goals come into conflict with each other. So if we have a multiplicity of goals that we are trying to achieve, when those goals come into conflict with each other, we are going to have to make some decisions about which goal we need to pursue in order to be effective. You think about from an organizational perspective, we have all these different values that we have in public sector. And the public administration, we have values, as we talked about, like effectiveness. We also have efficiency. We also have social equity. We have things such as political responsiveness, representative bureaucracy. Sometimes social equity may come into conflict with the goals such as efficiency. Sometimes protection of individual rights will come into conflict with efficiency or effectiveness. And there are choices that need to be made. And oftentimes the goal attainment approach is too simplistic to really take into account those choices that need to be made between that multiplicity of goals. Also, in terms of goals, sometimes we have what are called official goals and operative goals. Official goals are the long-term goals of an organization, for example. Operative goals are kind of the steps along the way. And so we'll achieve an operative goal on the way to then achieving our official goal. So operative goals tend to be much more shorter term. Official goals tend to be much longer term in nature. And sometimes we have difficulty parceling out the difference between those operative goals and those official goals. So even though the goal approach is the simplest approach, it's by far the most common approach that we use to measure effectiveness in the public sector. It is somewhat limited and sometimes is a little bit too simplistic. A second model of effectiveness is we can define effectiveness in the systems resource approach. In the systems resource approach, we define effectiveness as looking at the resources that an organization is able to import from its environment, or that a policy or a program is able to import from its environment. And the more resources you can import, the more effective you are as an organization, a program, or a policy. So effectiveness is measured by the ability to exploit environmental resources. This is very similar to when we discussed last week theoretical approaches. This is open systems theory. The idea of negative entropy, that organizations not only dissipate energy into their environment, but they can then import new energies into their organization to stave off agency decay and deterioration. So this is pretty much open systems type of an approach. Systems resource approach, the way in which we would do it is that we would, on a longitudinal basis, look at the resources an organization has, and then over time measure those resources and how those resources have increased over time. If you have a large increase in resources over time, then obviously that's going to be a measure of effectiveness. The utility of a systems resource approach is it's oftentimes a way to measure effectiveness when other indicators are difficult to obtain or hard to measure. So for instance, if we are having trouble identifying the goals of our project, our program, our policy, or our organization, we cannot clearly identify what we are trying to achieve, then we can use a systems resource approach as an alternative measurement of effectiveness for either our organization, our program, or our policy. Then there's a third approach to measuring effectiveness in which we measure effectiveness based upon how satisfied our key strategic constituencies are with our organization or with the program or with the policy that we are implementing. So we look at our key stakeholders and we see how satisfied those key stakeholders are. Now, in terms of the participant satisfaction model, we also have to recognize that some of our key stakeholders are external to the organization, but some of our key stakeholders are employees within our organization as well. So this participant satisfaction model, where we are measuring effectiveness based upon how satisfied our stakeholders are, if we are looking external to our organization at external stakeholders, it kind of bleeds over into the open systems type of approach because we're looking outside the walls of the organization. If we are looking at key constituencies within our organization, then it kind of bleeds over into the internal process, human relations type of approach. In that, in order to keep our employees happy, we will provide them with the incentives that they value in order to keep them happy and to keep them satisfied. So the participant satisfaction model can bleed over either external environment or can also focus on the internal environment with our internal employees. But basically, our measure of effectiveness is how satisfied are our key stakeholders with what we are doing, either as an organization or what's being done in the program and the policy. And then our fourth model is what's called an internal process model. The internal process model is we will look internal to the organization at the internal activities, and we'll assess effectiveness based upon the internal health and efficiency within the organization. Effectiveness will be defined basically as organizational harmony. So we'll look at the culture within the organization, we'll look at the processes going on within the organization, and if the organization demonstrates organizational health, then that is a measure of effectiveness. So some of the indicators we look at for organizational health are things such as a strong organizational culture and a positive work climate, teamwork, team spirit, group loyalty, confidence, trust, and communication between workers and management, decision making that is being done near information sources, meaning that people who have the responsibility for engaging in activities will have the decision-making power for how they will be doing their jobs, regardless of where they are placed in the formal organizational structure. It's important to place decision-making power in close proximity to where those decisions are being made. The sharing of relevant facts and feelings, both horizontally and vertically. Rewards that are given to managers for performance, growth, and the development of subordinates, very much in a human resource management type of approach like we talked about last week. And the interactions between the organization and its component parts, where when we have conflict, like Mary Parker Follett told us last week, that conflict is always resolved in the interest of the health of the organization. So we're looking at those internal processes and the amount of organizational health that is demonstrated by the organization. That will then be our measure of effectiveness. So as you can see with these four different models, goal attainment model, systems resource model, participant satisfaction model, and internal process model, there are different ways in which we can measure effectiveness in the public sector. So I think sometimes we have to be careful when we talk about effectiveness. It's not all about achieving goals. And there are other ways in which effectiveness can be measured by public organizations. On this next screen, I've just given you some discrete measures and dimensions of effectiveness provided to us by Campbell. It's relatively dated, but I think it's still a lot of it is very appropriate. Things such as productivity levels, if you're in a government corporation, profit perhaps, quality of the products, the services and goods that are being created, accident levels, growth of the organization, absentee levels, employee turnover, job satisfaction, motivation levels, employee morale, how well we're able to control the work that's going on within the organization, the amount of conflict versus cohesion within the organization, how flexible the organization is in terms of its ability to adapt to the external environment. Strategic planning processes can be indicators. The amount of goal consensus we have, whereby we have agreement on the goals that we are trying to achieve as an organization. We have agreement in terms of the goals we're trying to achieve with our public policies and our public programs. The internalization of these goals, role and norm congruence among people within the organization, interpersonal skills of managers and organizations, task skills of managers and organizations, how information is managed and communicated, the readiness of the organization to respond to challenges, how well organizations and programs and policies can utilize the external environment to, again, import those new resources in very much of a systems resource type of a model. Evaluations by external stakeholders, very much in a participant satisfaction model of effectiveness. the stability of organizations and our policies, the value we place upon human resources, how much we respect public administrators and place a value upon their development as human resources, the amount of participation that's going on within our organizations and with the implementation of policies and programs, training and development, professional development types of opportunities, and the emphasis that the organization places upon achievement. Again, those are just some discrete measures of effectiveness in allowing us a more quantitative, empirical way of measuring the effectiveness, not only of organizations, but also of our programs and our policies. I think in this 500 class, it's important for us because when we talk about public administration and being in an MPA program, we are usually in an MPA program to develop the skills and to develop the techniques that will make us more effective leaders and managers in the public sector. But we never really get at this question of what do we mean by more effective? And that was the purpose of this discussion tonight, is to show you that effectiveness in the public sector is really multifaceted. It's multidimensional, and there are multiple ways in which we can measure effectiveness in the public sector. But regardless of how we're measuring effectiveness, the goal is that what we are doing in the public sector will be effective, in that it will have a positive impact on the people we come into contact with, a positive impact upon our organizations, a positive impact upon our fellow employees. And hopefully that's kind of definition of effectiveness is what we are trying to achieve with the skills that you'll be learning here in the MPA program. Now, the way in which you'll be using this information is there is a question on the final assessment that asks you about the different measures of effectiveness, those 4 different models of effectiveness that you'll then be able to apply as you work on that final assessment. Okay, we've covered a lot of information from policy analysis through program evaluation, through this discussion of the multi-dimensional nature of effectiveness in the public sector. Do you have any questions about policy analysis, program evaluation? Again, it's just kind of a foreshadowing of what you'll get later on in the program. Okay, this is kind of the first half of our discussion of the functions of public administration. Then where we go from here is that next week, well, we don't have time to get into it now. So next week, we will talk about 2 more functions of public administration that relate to our core curriculum: the management of human resources in the first half of class next week, and then the management of fiscal resources in our second half. Once we complete our discussion of management of fiscal resources, we have then completed all the material that we typically cover here in the 500 class, and you'll have all the information that you need in order to do an excellent job on the final assessment that is then due on Tuesday, October 10th. At that point, then, this course is over. And once you turn in that final assessment, you are completed with all the requirements for the course, so you can then move onward and upward to your future courses in the program. Okay, if there are no other questions or anything else, then we will call it a night at this point in time, and I'll go ahead and get this recording up onto our Canvas site by tomorrow morning. Then you have Canvas essay number 4 that you will be turning in for next week, looking at the discipline of public administration, and then we will actually conclude our information for the class when we get back together again next Tuesday. Okay, thanks everyone. Have a great evening, have a great week, and I will talk to you again next Tuesday.